Great, we're just going to wait a few seconds. We are up to 48 participants. And then we will start. Great, I think the run rate is slowing down and we will start our program today. Thank you everyone for joining us at this inaugural member meeting for the Business Alliance to Scale Climate Solutions, BASCS for short. My name is Amir Azim and I am a director in our climate practice at BSR. As the first meeting for BASCS, we have decided to open it up by invite and are really excited that you all are able to attend. First, some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be published to the BASCS website. You can engage how you want, use the chat to introduce yourself, post comments, and connect with others. And if you have any questions, please send it using the Q&A function in the Zoom control panel. Today's agenda will start with a panel discussion on COP26 implications for the voluntary carbon markets, followed by a Q&A. And then we will shift to the draft consensus guidance on high-quality tropical forest carbon credits. WWF and EDF will give a presentation with a short Q&A at the end. But first, allow me to provide a brief introduction to BASCS. We at BASCS firmly believe that corporate climate funding is a critical component and, more importantly, is a catalyst to scaling climate solutions necessary to achieve a 1.5-degree aligned future. BASCS is here to help. Our mission is to increase the scale and impact of climate solutions funding and to assist corporate funders as we pivot from ambition to climate action. As a platform, the Alliance is a neutral body that welcomes companies at all levels of their climate solutions journey to engage with other companies and technical experts in this field. Second, we are a company and a climate funder-driven initiative. Think of us as a REBA, but for carbon markets and climate solutions. We are agnostic to the type of climate solutions and look to explore different forms of investments across removals and avoidance, nature-based solutions, and technological solutions. Finally, we believe collaboration is a key aspect if we are to scale volume and deliver the kind of impact that is needed from carbon credit purchases and other climate solutions funding. We currently have 4 work streams within BASCS: blue carbon, tropical forests, standards and integrity, and technological carbon reduction and removals. The development of these work streams was largely driven by member interests, and more work streams will be added as the Alliance continues to grow and interests of the membership continue to evolve. Through BASCS, we will scale impact by providing the resources to corporates to internally develop effective climate solution platforms. At BASCS, we learn and act together through the work streams such as those mentioned in the previous slide. Through these work streams, companies can identify, vet, and deploy funding towards high-impact climate solutions, achieving greater scale by participating in co-investments with peers. Lastly, BASCS can provide a platform to share this collective success and support the high integrity and high impact demand side narrative. This inaugural meeting is just the first of many activities where we learn together and explore relevant and fairly complex topics. Our panel today will be a download from COP on carbon markets. We're joined by Mark Kenber, who is the Executive Director for External Affairs at the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, and he is also CEO of Climate Advisors Trust UK. Mark was formerly the CEO at the Climate Group and has spent over 2 decades working on environment, climate, and energy issues. We have Annette Nazareth, the co-chair of IC-VCM, which is Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon markets. Annette is a former SEC commissioner and currently a senior counsel at Davis Polk. For nearly a year, Annette has guided and served as the operating lead for TS-VCM. Kelley Kizzier, she's a VP at Global Climate at EDF, where she leads EDF's work to promote climate policy and company action with a focus on multilateral climate agreements and global cooperation on carbon markets. Kelley served for 3 years as the UNFCCC's co-chair for the UN climate negotiations under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Then we have Pedro Barrata, who is a senior director for climate policy at EDF. Pedro is the co-chair of the expert panel at IC-VCM. He is an international carbon markets expert, having assisted in the negotiations on the development of the Kyoto carbon markets mechanism since 1999. And finally, we have our moderator, Elizabeth Sturcken. Elizabeth is an MD at EDF and directly works on EDF Plus business team, working with leading companies to develop and implement joint projects, and has served in roles at the EPA, the Bank of Boston, and the Office of Management and Budget. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Amir. I really appreciate it. Well, we are all here, not just the panelists, but you all virtually listening in because we care about solving the climate crisis. And we realize that to do so, we need to close the climate funding gap. And there is a great opportunity to gather together and learn and act, which is why BASS was created. Some really interesting things of note with the carbon market and the climate finance generally. The voluntary carbon market hit a milestone of $1 billion in value late last year. And there is, of course, increasing interest in this because of the wave of corporate climate commitments. And as of last year, net zero commitments had been made by at least 1/5 of the world's largest public companies, representing 14 trillion in sales, and many more at COP26. So the number of companies purchasing credits is increasing. 2018, it was 20%, and then in 2019, it increased to 30%. So we can see what is happening here. The market is poised for long-term growth. The Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets concluded that to meaningfully support a 1.5-degree pathway, the voluntary carbon market needs to grow by at least 15 times by 2030. So for that to do so, and for us to achieve our goals of a stable climate, we know that climate finance and the carbon markets can really be real help in speeding action, maximizing climate ambition, especially in the short term. But to do so, it has to work, it has to function really well. And these folks around the table need to do their work. And it's super exciting that the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets and the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative have been created and are rolling along. They are trying to solve some of the hardest challenges that we face in the voluntary carbon market side of the puzzle. Indeed, something major happened at COP26. Don't know if you heard about it, but Article 6 was resolved after many years of work, and we will get some understanding of that too from our panelists to really understand the voluntary and regulated markets and how they fit together. And again, how they all can add up to driving increasing climate ambition. So let me start by asking Annette, and maybe you could put up the slide with the IC-VCM. Could you tell us what the goal of it, what the purpose of it is?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you so much to BACS for inviting me to speak here. And it is amazing how all of us on this panel spend so much time together now, which is really wonderful. There's a real joint commitment on the part of very thoughtful people, I think, to to address the climate change issue. So as this slide says, we have this new Integrity Council, and it's a governance body that is represented with some very, very talented international players. And our goal is to set and enforce standards for the voluntary carbon markets to help address the climate challenge. Now, what does that really mean? What it means is that we have some real issues today, right? We have voluntary carbon markets, but they're not of a uniform integrity. There are not uniform standards on how one measures, a ton of carbon and how one would trade carbon in a way that would lead to confidence in the markets. And as you said, Elizabeth, to really move the dial here, we have to be prepared to scale up perhaps 15 times what trading is today. But we don't want to do that if the market isn't transparent, it doesn't have integrity, there isn't liquidity in the market, there isn't confidence in the market. And we all know there have been concerns about things like greenwashing. Well, we're not interested in perpetuating problems like that. We're interested in creating a market where folks like your members here can be confident that they can really help in the carbon crisis by investing in carbon credits in ways that will meaningfully reduce our carbon footprint. So, what we're hoping is that by scaling up the market and doing so in a context of core carbon principles, which are high integrity principles that we will establish for trading carbon credits, and also setting up assessment standards to ensure that those credits are actually put into place and enforced. By doing that, we're hoping that we create a market infrastructure that will, very much foster voluntary carbon markets. So we're very excited about that. We believe that we've set up an excellent governance process to do that. The governance process itself, as I said, has people of great integrity, both on the governing body, but also on our expert panel. And you'll see later when you hear from Pedro just how impressive and expert this panel is that is helping us to develop these core carbon principles and to set new industry standards. So let me stop there because I know others have a lot to say, but needless to say, we're very excited about the Integrity Council and what we've achieved so far, but there's lots more to do.
Thanks so much, Annette. I know from now almost 25 years of working with companies is that oftentimes they like to move fast. And I think in this case, there's some benefit. You really have companies jumping in, wanting to, in addition to critically reducing their own emissions from their operations and their supply chains, they really want to think about how they can help solve climate change outside their value chains. But as you say, to do so, and if they use the markets, it really needs to be done with high quality and integrity. So we almost need your work to have been done yesterday, which begs the question, what's the timing on what you're producing and what are the outputs that you'll be putting out to companies and the market in general?
Well, thank you for that question, because it does give me the opportunity to emphasize something that you alluded to, which is that time is absolutely of the essence, but we can't rush this to a point where we're sacrificing quality. And so we have an imperative to move very quickly, while at the same time, again, coming up with CCPs that are of high integrity. And so to do that, our expert panel is working apace. In fact, we had a meeting earlier today. I've seen many of the people on this screen in earlier meetings even today. They're making very good progress on the CCPs, meeting very frequently. And our hope is that they will have some draft CCPs that can be put out for public consultation in March. And we look very forward to, again, a transparent notice and comment process, really quite similar to regulated markets, and to take the input that we receive to finalize the CCPs and have a good set that we can start operating with sometime mid-year. And obviously work will continue. There'll be lots of other questions and things that will need to be added to that, and it'll be an ongoing process. But we really want to be in a position where we could start to see some trading based on those CCPs in perhaps the second or third quarter.
Thanks. That's really helpful to understand. And after that guidance is finalized, Annette, what will the role of IC-VCM be? What do you see as an ongoing role for your group?
Well, I wish I could say that we'd just wrap it up and that would be it, but this is going to go on for quite some time because not only will we continue to work on CCPs, we also have to work on an assessment process. As I said, this is not just an issue of issuing standards, but also ensuring that the standards are being followed. So we're going to need an assessment process. But beyond that, there's so much for us to do because we really are trying to stand up a market, right? So it's not just what are the attributes of the product, it's what are the attributes of the market. So what are the legal terms on which these things are going to trade? How are the trades going to be reported? How transparent will the trades be? All the attributes that you can think of for other transparent regulated markets would apply here. Registries, clearing houses. I mean, there's just so much of the infrastructure work that we are also trying to work on at the same time. Again, we're not forming these things ourselves. We have very robust capital markets where there are lots of market players who are eager to get involved in this area, but certainly we want to have an imprimatur on how that's done so that we can ensure that on an ongoing basis we have scaled up very robust, liquid, transparent markets of integrity, and we want to make sure that all of those attributes are in place.
That's a big job and a lot to
Yes.
We're really building on a lot of the work that is currently being done on all those aspects, including we'll hear from Lloyd Gamble and Ruben Lebowski later on the tropical forest side. So hopefully all those quality criteria are feeding in and you're building upon what's out there already. So I really think about IC-VCM as the supply side, and the voluntary carbon markets initiative is focusing more on the demand side. And so the VCMI is really critical for companies in particular because as companies jump into this space, not only do they want to know that they are purchasing carbon credits that have the highest quality and highest integrity and actually drive climate outcomes, they really want to know what can they claim, like what can count towards their emissions, how do they communicate about this? How do they, what do they do on the claim side? It's from a company perspective, it's critically important. So maybe I'll turn it over to you, Mark, to talk about the goal of VCMI, and we'll jump in there.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks again to Basques for inviting me today. I mean, I think you framed it very, very nicely. The IC-VCM, which I have the honor of being on the board of as well, led by Annette, looks at the supply side. So everything from the idea behind a project through to the generation of credits and their transaction. And the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative looks at the demand side, i.e. the buyers. And so we specifically look at what are the conditions or what are the prerequisites for credible participation in voluntary carbon markets by corporate buyers? What kind of how should they be using credits? And I emphasize not what kind of credits, because we very much want to lean on the IC-VCM and potentially the Article 6 supervisory body for what defines high integrity credits, but how they should be using credits and what are the claims that companies can make about that use of credits. And I think I echo one of the things that Annette just said, that it's not just about the integrity, it's not just the integrity of individual projects and credits that's important, it's the integrity of the market. And both bodies have as a guiding principle that carbon market investments, use of carbon credits, should be additional to decarbonisation by companies and government action. It can't be a substitute. It certainly can't be an escape clause, because I think, as we all know, and our starting premise you'll see on the second bullet here is that while we need governments and corporates to take the lead in decarbonising rapidly, in reality, if we're going to keep below 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce as many emissions as we possibly can, as quickly as we can. And the carbon markets, voluntary and regulated, can provide a way to do that. So, as I said, we're very much designed to complement the work of IC-VCM, but also organizations like the Science Based Targets Initiative and others who are working with corporates to set science-aligned pathways so that the use of carbon credits is above and beyond the decarbonisation that companies should be taking. And we think that this point about integrity, and it's no coincidence that both our bodies have the word integrity in their name, because although, as you said, Elizabeth, the market hit this milestone of $1 billion last year, it's a market that's existed for nearly 2 decades. And really, for a 2-decade-old market, $1 billion is not a huge amount of money. And I think one of the reasons that I think that many of us agree that it hasn't scaled before is because it hasn't been perceived to have integrity. It's not been perceived to be credible or legitimate. We've all seen over the last 2 decades stories by journalists, by investigative NGOs who have shown, found projects that have been over-crediting or haven't been additional. In other words, haven't gone above and beyond what would have happened otherwise. That the claims being made about the projects have been varied, not always consistent, and not always robust. And that lack of integrity, and I suspect many of the participants on this call would echo that. They've had interest in engaging in voluntary carbon markets, but have asked themselves the question, is it really worth it if we're likely to be the subject of some nasty report or an investigation or a trashing by an NGO because we've, in good faith, gone into a market, but found out that we haven't really understood it, or it hasn't been as legitimate as we'd hoped. And I think if both IC-VCM and VCMI are successful, then we will have end-to-end integrity across the voluntary carbon markets and more broadly voluntary use of carbon credits. And that should give companies and investors and financiers confidence to go into the market, because what they're investing in, what they're trading in, is something really robust. So specifically around the VCMI, we have a similar multi-stakeholder process as the IC-VCM. In fact, a lot of overlap. I think at least 4 people I can see on the screen participate in both initiatives in one form or another, which is both a good thing because it means there's coordination, but it may mean we're in a bit of an echo chamber. Time will tell on that. But what VCMI is proposing to do in its first phase, which ends at the end of this April, is provide guidance for companies on when, how, and how they should be making voluntary use of carbon credits. And as I said, the claims that they can make about them. We've just produced a first round of initial recommendations, and it's no secret I've offered to Basques to hold a workshop with those of the members who would be interested to hear more about that. We will have a draft that we have set recommendations that we can share in the second half of February. And when we produce this guidance at the end of April, that will, as Annette said, it's certainly not the end of the journey. It's just a milestone in what looks like being a much longer journey. And we will have what we'll be calling a beta version of our claims guidance. And we encourage as many companies as possible to road test it with us, feedback to us with how it works, whether it works, what needs to be improved. It's very much just like the work the IC-VCM is doing. This is not designed to be a set of glossy reports that sits behind me on my Zoom calls. It's designed to be something practical, a manual that companies can use and really go step by step, understand what they need to do first, what they need to report, what kind of credits they should be buying, what claims they can make, and how they should substantiate that. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer any further questions you might have on that.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mark. That was really clear and helpful. Much like the IC-VCM, we almost need this guidance. I know it's slated for end of April and needed it to have been done in the past, right? So companies could understand what to do right now. So any advice for this time period when we're waiting for the guidance to come out? I am keenly concerned that companies will not move forward and not act boldly while waiting for guidance. Do you have any thoughts on this? I realize it's a hard question, but it's an important one.
Well, Kelley can kick me under the virtual table if I'm giving any secrets away, but I think it's pretty clear that the guidance will say that companies who want to use carbon credits to meet some kind of voluntary commitment, whether it's carbon neutrality or climate neutrality, whatever it may be, have to have robust decarbonisation plans within their own companies. And that's what in all self-respecting companies should be doing anyway. So there's no reason to wait on that for guidance from us or from the full core carbon principles before you start taking action at source. I think there is still, it's certainly important to understand both the Article 6 market, which others will talk about, and the voluntary carbon market before engaging in it. Because while both the IC-VCM and VCMI are trying to, well, will be setting a high standards of integrity which companies can follow, there are, as we've known over the last 2 decades, there are many pitfalls in this market. There are many people selling many different products, many different services, and many different credits. And it's important to really understand what the market is about. That's not to say that everybody has to be a market expert, but there's a lot of caveat emptor in this market. However well designed, between Annette and ourselves, we managed to get it there. As in any market, there are people looking to make a fast buck. So be aware of what's out there. Think about what it is you want to achieve beyond your decarbonisation pathway. Are you looking at something that will be adding to your marketing propositions? Are you looking to have products or services that demonstrate your climate leadership? Are you appealing to your investors, to your broader stakeholders? That will determine to a certain extent what kind of commitment you make, what kind of claims you want to make, and that in turn will drive the action you need to make both at home and your engagement with the market. So while the guidance may not be ready, there is no shortage of things that companies can be doing already and probably should be doing already.
Yes, great point. And the guidance will be ready, finalized, you hope, by April, is that correct?
So we will have a first full draft of the draft version of the guidance in the middle of March. And as I said before, reached out to Basques to offer to do a joint workshop with those members who would be interested in reading through the guides and providing us with feedback. We'll take that back to our expert advisory group, which Kelley is the co-chair of, and to our steering committee. And then we will publish the final version. When I say final, the version that is ready to be used by corporates over the rest of 2022. We hope to get robust feedback from companies, but also from governments some of whom are looking at this, at how it could or should be incorporated into consumer protection regulation or advertising regulation. We want something that is fit for purpose, and that companies feel that when they make claims using our guidance, they are probably, I can't guarantee that they'll be unimpeachable, but they're as close to unimpeachable as possible. They're respected by civil society, by governments, and by their peers. But there's also a way to distinguish between those who are really doing the right thing from those who are making a claim that isn't substantiated. So it's important that there's kind of robust governance and assurance around it as well. And that's what we'll be working on after April.
Okay, thanks so much. Now to turn to my esteemed colleagues, Kelley and Pedro, to talk about Article 6. So Kelley, Pedro, what are the most important implications of the Article 6 decision that came at this last COP? And what should the voluntary carbon market and companies be doing now to prepare?
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to the Basque team for putting this together and for having me today. I might just start with a brief overview of Article 6 so we're all on the same page before I dive into the implications. So Article 6 is the part of the Paris Agreement that deals with international cooperation through carbon markets. It was the last article to be agreed in Paris. And though we managed to get agreement on most of the Paris Agreement rulebook at COP24 in Katowice, we didn't get agreement on the rules for Article 6. So apparently we like being last. When we failed to agree these rules at COP25 in Madrid, and then had this massive boom in the voluntary carbon market, I think there was some extra incentive to push very hard to get agreement at COP26 in Glasgow. And lo and behold, we were successful, not least because of the amazing co-chairing, which Annette's co-chair in the IC-VCM, Hugh Seeley, was also the co-chair of the Article 6 discussion. So just more echo chamber, I guess, but it's probably important to mention because it's just another connection between these processes. So Article 6 has three main parts. Article 6.2 provides for the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, and if you're talking to anybody who's done Article 6, you're going to hear the term ITMO a lot, towards NDCs. These are nationally determined contributions. And these are the targets and commitments that countries take under the Paris Agreement. So under Article 6.2, countries agreed on guidance for the transparency and accounting of these transfers. Article 6.4 is a central mechanism supervised by a UN body. It's a bit like the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism. And here, countries agreed rules, modalities, and procedures for the operation of the new mechanism. And finally, we have Article 6.8, which establishes a work program for a framework for non-market approaches. That's a mouthful. I'm not going to focus on that here because it is non-market approach and we're focused more on carbon markets here. The main sticking points for agreement going into the negotiations and for several years have been whether and how to account for credits generated outside the scope of an NDC. And this is the question about the application of corresponding adjustments. You can hear that term a lot too, corresponding adjustments. There were questions about how to operationalize a share of proceeds to fund adaptation for most vulnerable countries, whether and to what extent credits left over from the Kyoto Protocol can be used towards commitments under the Paris Agreement, and the best approach for determining baselines and assessing additionality, approaches that are aligned with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. At COP26, countries were pretty successful at sorting through all of these issues, and we're left with a robust rule book for Article 6. It's not perfect, they never are, in a consensus process that requires the agreement of basically all of the world's countries, but it's much better than I expect, and I think better than most people expected in terms of environmental integrity. So I think one of the massive questions going in was this question of corresponding adjustment. And a corresponding adjustment is basically double entry bookkeeping when it comes to international accounting between countries. If one country sells a reduction or removal credit to another country, they give up the claim to that to count it towards their NDC. So that double counting is avoided. It's always only in one side of the ledger. There's been a real question about how this applies to the voluntary carbon market because you're not talking about country to country accounting. And unfortunately, the Article 6 rules did not come down solidly on this, but they did really create some clarity and a pathway. So if a country authorizes a credit, it's an ITMO and there must be a corresponding adjustment. For international compliance purposes, that means to achieve your NDC or for airlines to comply with their obligations under the UN, a corresponding adjustment is always required. So the rules create a path, but not an obligation for corresponding adjustments in the voluntary carbon market. Host countries, that's where the product or activity takes place. They can, but they don't have to authorize voluntary carbon market activities. That means that the countries hosting these activities have more responsibility, but also more discretion under Article 6 than they previously had. And in the end, it means that the voluntary carbon market can continue to coexist and supplement Article 6 activities and the low carbon transition. And any of the proponents for these activities can seek authorization under Article 6.2 or under Article 6.4. And if they do so, they're going to have to comply with these extra Article 6 rules, but they don't have to in order to continue to contribute. And I'm going to hand to Pedro because Article 6 also creates some other new rules. So Pedro, if you want to speak to those.
Yep. Very quickly to say there are a number of rules that are new under the Article 6 6.4 mechanism in particular. And these relate to, let's say, adjusting to the new framework of Paris. So, for example, the baselines under Article 6.4 now have to take into account the NDC themselves. So that should have been obvious, but it is a good point that it's there, and it increases the robustness of the baselines. It also means that the baselines will have to be adjusted dynamically. Also on Article 6.4, there are additionally some rules in terms of the crediting periods for different types of projects. And there is overall a stricter and more concrete definition of additionality than the one that we knew from the clean development mechanism. Also, from the outcome of the COP, we have a transition of the CDM. This was, as I think Kelley mentioned, this was a critical issue in the negotiations for a long time. And let's say that the outcome is rather on the positive side, in that there is a limited transition of both credits and projects from the CDM into the new mechanism. And furthermore, there is this assumption that the new mechanism and its supervisory board will be looking into the adequacy of the methodologies of the CDM to, let's say, kickstart the new mechanism. With relation to the transition of the projects themselves, units can only be carried from projects that have been registered after 2013, which limits it quite significantly. And so there is still scope for some transition for some transfer of units, but overall, this has been a relatively good outcome. And I think it's an outcome that we had all in the carbon market been looking for a number of years. And I think we also issued a sigh of relief when it came to the actual quality of the outcome.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just quickly to jump back in. I see you put up the slide. I love this slide because I think it kind of explains the flow for those that think visually. But I have to give credit. This was developed by Charlotte Sturcken Climate Advisors. Before anyone thinks that I created this, I did not. And I want to be able to give credit where credit is due.
So there's a fair bit of confusion around Article 6 and the implications for business, just varying levels of knowledge of what this really means. Do you want to give kind of a bottom line for as much as you can for what companies should be thinking about and kind of how this will play into their what they're doing right now and how they're acting and what they're moving forward on?
I mean, I think the direct impact is a little bit hard to sort of qualify or quantify. I think in the absence of Article 6 rules, there was a lot of confusion. People didn't know what the direction of travel was going to be, and that was sort of a barrier to market development. I think now that we have some certainty around Article 6, and we're going to see countries begin to implement and put in place the administrative procedures they need, we're just going to get more and more clarity. So one of my main messages to companies would be, don't delay investment in urgent climate action. And also that we're trying to build through all of this a carbon market that is better and better able to show you what high quality is and to direct your investment. But it's 2022 and it's urgent. We need investment in the high quality credits. The Article 6 rules are in place. Countries are starting to implement what they need to implement. And these sort of, norm setting bodies are also here, including through the BAS group, to help us guide that action. Great.
I wanted to formally open the floor up for questions. If you could put them in the Q&A, and we can switch to a conversation before we turn it over to Ruben and Lloyd. I see that the first question is, how are we assessing the robustness of decarbonization plans? Interesting. It's a little on-market question. Is VCMI taking that on also?
No, we are not. And I say that very deliberately because one, I think we have a very clear focus, which is about claims related to the use of carbon credits. But perhaps more importantly, because there are other initiatives who are already well advanced looking at this space. I already mentioned the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has set both sort of guidance for how companies should set targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement and also net zero goals. But there's also the Transition Pathways Initiative, and I imagine there will be others that are assessing how credible corporate plans, but also corporate actions are in terms of contributing to the Paris Agreement. So as I mentioned, in my initial presentation, we're not trying to reinvent or duplicate or complicate what other people are doing, but rather, hopefully, over the course of the next year, we will become part of a seamless ecosystem of initiatives that are playing with each other, IC-VCM, VCMI, SBTI, and others, so that for companies, there's a very clear pathway from setting internal goals through to acquiring carbon credits, making claims. The reporting is, I mean, my dream would be that the reporting is standardized. There is full transparency across the system so that those on the outside can see who's doing the right thing and who isn't. People will have confidence in what's going on. So that was a long way of saying, no, we're not going to do that, but we certainly will lean on the work of others.
Can I say also, Elizabeth, I think we are definitely seeing a lot of work internationally on disclosure and transparency of what companies' plans are in this area. I know there's a lot of work at the SEC and a number of international initiatives, and so I think that as well is going to be very helpful, because if you can sort of compare initiatives across companies in an industry, you certainly get a sense of how robust the ambitions are. And I think so. I think there are, as Mark said, a huge number of efforts in train at this point, and hopefully they all sort of come together in a very seamless way.
Yes, including the Secretary General's announcement on trying to rationalize standards. I don't know that that has gone anywhere. If you do know and fill in on that process, that seems important to pay attention to, and companies should know about that. But let me maybe tack on a question. Someone was asking about ICROA's role in quality assurance in the voluntary carbon market. So if someone could explain ICROA and their role, that would be great.
Well, I can tell you what ICROA is. ICROA is an association that was founded, I guess, probably 14 or 15 years ago now, of the main brokers, project developers, and others in the voluntary carbon, actually the clean development mechanism space as well at the time. And it was to provide it has a voluntary code of conduct against which all its members are audited, and it includes elements about transparency of transactions, the way in which customers should be engaged, the use of the kinds of credits that can be used and sold to their customers. It's a self-regulating body, but which has been very successful. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's now fairly closely aligned with the International Emissions Trading Association, and is certainly a group that we will be consulting with, because obviously their members have direct access to a large number of corporates who we expect to be making claims around voluntary use of carbon credits. And I would imagine, Annette, that ICROA, either directly or through IETA, has been pretty closely involved with the work of the IC-VCM as well.
Yes. So a third question is, curious to know how the outcomes of COP26 will impact the development of nature-based solutions projects, in particular in developing countries.
Well, I can take that one very simply by saying the fact alone that we have an outcome at COP26 will already advance that. The market is definitely moving towards let's say a stress or an emphasis on nature-based solutions. That's clear. We see it in the statistics, and a lot of those billion-dollar investments are going increasingly towards those solutions. So what happens now with relation to Article 6.4 is that those who are interested in developing nature-based projects will have to submit the methodology and have it approved and go through the, let's say, the mill of the supervisory body. But at least the expectation is that will be a much faster process now, because we have a lot of ground that has been done with the previous Kyoto Protocol mechanisms. That, with relation to what progress can be made under Article 6 and Article 6.4, regardless of Article 6.4, the fact that we have Article 6.2 can also mean that companies can engage in these projects and have them even certified under Article 6.2 and apply corresponding adjustments if that's the case, according to the new rules of Glasgow.
Good. Maybe it makes sense to turn it back over to you, Amir, if there are no more questions. Great.
There you go. Thank you, Elizabeth. Share. Great. We will move on to our next segment. We're joined by Lloyd Gamble, who's the Director for Forests and Climate at WWF. Lloyd serves as the Red Plus Multilateral Finance Lead for WWF. And then we're also joined by Ruben Lebowski, who oversees EDF's efforts to reduce emissions by protecting tropical forests. They will be presenting the draft guidance on high-quality tropical forest carbon credits. Lloyd, over to you.
Thanks, Amir. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Great. Hi, everyone. Lloyd Gamble here with World Wildlife Fund US, and I'm joined by Ruben Lebowski with EDF. Both of our organizations are founding partners of BASCS, and really appreciate the opportunity today to discuss this emerging guidance on tropical forest carbon credits, which of course is super relevant to the vision of BASCS. It's also one of the goals, by the way, of the BASCS Tropical Forest Issue Group for us to share this work today. So I'm going to open up with a few basic concepts and challenges to set the stage for Ruben, who will then discuss the recommendations of this draft consensus document that we'll be describing. A previous slide still, please, Amir. Then the Salesforce team is offered to provide a couple of reflections from a company vantage point before we open up to Q&A. Our objectives today are simply to introduce you to this resource and process, and to encourage you to submit comments to the public consultation that's underway now until mid-February. Next slide, please. So why are we and our partner organizations taking this issue on now? Well, this group knows the significance of forests, not only to climate, but to biodiversity, to indigenous peoples and local communities, and also, frankly, to sustainable business. And with growing corporate leadership on climate, we're seeing massive interest in nature-based solutions, and this presents a tremendous opportunity that we collectively want to harness. But this rapid growth in demand also presents some risks, particularly if it is not differentiated with regard to high quality. For example, some companies can be criticized if the credibility of their investments is called into question. And more broadly, we could miss the mark on the most transformational investments for forests and climate. So these are the motivating factors to provide this type of guidance to companies who are buying credits. In terms of scope, we deliberately focus here on carbon credits, but with the important caveat that we view credits as one tool in the nature-based solutions toolbox and not as a substitute, as has been said, for deep decarbonization of companies in line with the science-based target and the mitigation hierarchy. Next slide, please. So at this inflection point of demand has compelled some of the world's farthest reaching NGOs convened by EDF to bridge some long-held differences around carbon credits and see if we could start to chart a path forward by working toward alignment amongst ourselves. So we initially tagged this simply the HQTFCC process, which stands for high quality tropical forest carbon credits. These 8 NGOs met regularly over the last half year to highlight what we think should be some of the most important priorities with regard to quality and impact in tropical forest carbon credits, culminating in a draft statement that we released back at COP26. Now, of course, it's a very busy space, and we're aware of the important work coming out of groups like TFVCM, VCMI, and others. We're not trying to duplicate these initiatives, but rather to feed in with this explicit focus on tropical forests and supply side integrity specifically. And we'll be further exploring those bridges in the month ahead. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are just a few basics of origination on forest carbon credits. This visual depicts a range of project and program scenarios that can generate carbon credits or mitigation outcomes that are the basis for these criteria. These include standalone carbon projects, projects that aspire to nest in jurisdictional conservation programs, jurisdictional programs themselves that may source jurisdictional credits at the jurisdictional level. And lastly, projects that are operationally and programmatically nested in jurisdictional programs and may also source credits directly. Next slide. Then what do we mean, generally speaking, by quality? Typically, we consider a range of environmental and social attributes that most of you are probably familiar with. I won't go into any detail with these now. But it's worth noting that some of these characteristics are explicitly linked to scale when we're in tropical forests. For example, smaller localized projects might be more prone to leakage or pushing threats out to surrounding areas. Other attributes such as transparency are largely independent of scale. And the various carbon standards, whether project or jurisdictional level, are set up to standardize and facilitate verification of these attributes. They're an important starting point in assessing quality, but as we'll get into a little bit, often should be augmented with due diligence to ensure high quality that you're usually looking for. Next slide. This is my last slide. Just a few other considerations that differentiate projects from jurisdictional programs and that have implications for the timing of supply, and as a result have driven some tension in voluntary markets. So projects, of course, are smaller, have a smaller sphere of control, and are typically less dependent on government. And for these reasons and others, they can deliver against project standards more quickly. And the last decade has seen fairly significant supply. Jurisdictions, on the other hand, target transformational change at scale and in line with the Paris Agreement. And we know this is the scale of change that we need in forests, but it also requires comprehensive planning, alignment, government engagement, and this all takes real time. So this schematic graph here is intended to show the relative near-term abundance of project-based credits, but also the importance of getting to jurisdictional scales and offerings like LEAF for long-term impact and more significant volumes. And taking this out just one more step, some have viewed projects as essential building blocks to jurisdictional performance, while others have raised concerns about projects channeling incentives primarily locally instead of systemically and under a different set of standards that can make nesting or integration challenging. So this all sets the stage for why we think this guidance is needed to break through some of these challenges. And clearly the strongest force to move us to high quality in tropical forest carbon credits is smart, differentiating demand from buyers for initiatives on the ground that are moving us toward transformational change. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Ruben, who will pick up on the draft recommendations. Thanks.
Thanks, Lloyd. Hi, everyone. Next slide, please. So Lloyd has set the stage in terms of the why of our group and why we joined together to put together this guidance. I'm going to talk now about the what of the guidance in terms of what we've come up with up to this stage of the process. And as Lloyd mentioned, we have a consultation process ongoing where we're very much looking for feedback, both on the current draft guidance, as well as on what we can do going forward in terms of further fleshing out some details or elaborating certain points. So broadly speaking, the objective was to talk about high quality, but also to think about how companies, through their demand, as Lloyd said, their differentiated demand, can help proactively improve on the market right now and help shape the future market. So the idea is that quality, we're trying to be practical. Quality, in different circumstances, there are differences in terms of what's possible, and also over time, there are differences in terms of what's possible. But we need to be driving forward with the goal of having the greatest, impact for the benefit of climate, forests, and people. So this guidance really breaks up into sort of three broad themes. Next slide, please. So there are these 7 elements, but 1, 2, and 6 are really focused on how do we try to make sure that purchases of credits are really helping to maximize overall climate ambition aligned with Paris. So the first bullet is that companies should certainly consider including tropical forest carbon credits, as part of their broader strategies. There's no pathway to meeting the goals of Paris without eliminating tropical deforestation, and it's an urgent priority for the world to get to its, ultimate net zero imperative. So there's an important role for credits, but and as we've heard, it's only one tool in the toolbox. Point 2 was really about this issue of reductions versus removals. I'll get more into this, but the group very strongly agrees that it's important to prioritize protection of existing forests. That's not in any way inferior, and in many cases, is the most urgent priority alongside efforts to scale up, reforestation and other removals. And then 6 is a lot about what we've heard about earlier, the importance for credits to be and voluntary actions to be aligning with the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So a little bit more detail on these points. As we've already heard, we need an all hands on deck effort to limit emissions. Corporates must have credible decarbonization targets for all their scopes. Mark said this very well. Credit should not be a substitute, but can be an important supplement to corporate ambitious leadership. And our specific guidance is that companies should have SBTI or equivalent targets. And also importantly, companies that have important footprints on forests and land use must also be taking on targets to eliminate their own footprint, and stop, any deforestation they themselves are causing within their own supply chains, in line with efforts such as the accountability framework. So companies need to be taking on these actions internally, and also carbon credits, particularly for tropical forests, can make a really important contribution for global climate goals. As we've said, on the issue of removals and reductions, we think it's important to support efforts to stop deforestation, protect standing forests. That's an urgent priority. Accelerating removals also needs to happen, but it's important not to be just doing removals, and also to be thinking at a landscape scale in terms of overall land use planning. So we're not on the one side of the landscape destroying forests and then getting credits for restoring. We need to be making progress simultaneously on both these priorities. And then on the alignment with Paris, the group developed most of this guidance before COP, so was not able to go into a lot of the details that we heard earlier, but was very much focused on the supply side integrity and making the point that corporate purchases have important roles to play, both in cases where corresponding adjustments might be required, but also in cases where they're contributing to implementing ambitious host country contributions, and where the accounting stays with the host country. both are critically important. Next slide, please. So the next set of recommendations are about how to really improve confidence around the supply side integrity. So point 3 is that there are really important social and environmental integrity components that are in many of the standards, as Lloyd said, but also these need to be supplemented with targeted due diligence. And then point 7 is ultimately what we want is for companies not to have to do this each time on their own, but for these higher quality requirements to really become institutionalized in current standards. Next slide. So ultimately, it's important to use high integrity standards and also do this extra due diligence that we provide more detail on in the document. And this extra due diligence has a social component as well as an environmental component. And these two components are actually inextricably linked. So a lot of our discussions in the group, actually COICA, the coordinating body of the indigenous organization of the Amazon basin countries, was an active participant, emphasizing the need for real effective participation and really strategic partnership of indigenous organizations throughout the process, from the beginning to the end of developing these projects and programs. They need to be critically aligned. And given how important indigenous organizations and communities are in terms of safeguarding forests and how much forests are under their control, without that, this is not going to work for the environment or for communities. So these are inextricably linked. And then on environmental safeguards, we identified several needs, such as evidence-based baselines, more conservative estimates of leakage, non-permanence, need for continuously updating with better data and science that they need to be, the company should look for, both for projects as well as jurisdictional efforts. And eventually these should be institutionalized in standards. Next slide, please. So a lot of the discussion, actually most of the discussion, was really focused on this issue that Lloyd teed up on the role of activities at different scales. So project scale and jurisdictional larger scale programs. And there was a very strong desire to help bridge differences of opinion, and not make it either or, but how can these two approaches really be synergistic and driving towards the large scale actions that we all want. So there was a very strong agreement in the group that companies should be actively pushing and supporting a rapid transition to these larger scale approaches through efforts such as LEAF and others that are already starting to move. And it's actually very important for companies, for example, to use forward purchase agreements or and future demand signals to help support these efforts. And then over time, there should be an evolution of the market, understanding that it's going to be different in different locations. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Next slide, please. So the guidance is really that there is an important continual role for project-based supply, both for existing projects as well as new projects that might be developed. But it's very important for these projects to be aligning with and certainly not impeding the transition to jurisdictional programs. So depending on the status of these jurisdictional programs in different places, what this looks like will be different, but it's very important to be supporting these larger scale, more transformational changes that are essential for stopping deforestation at massive scales, and which we need for forests as well as for the climate goals. And then we should be pushing jurisdictional programs, companies through forward contracts when these programs aren't readily available. And overall, the portfolio should be shifting more to jurisdictional or what we call fully nested programs. So next slide. And this is just a figure from the document. I won't go through all the details, but highlighting how, what Lloyd talked about. Right now, the market is dominated by credits, which are the gray and the green, from project scale activities. But the goal is to be transitioning those, integrating them, into jurisdictional programs so that they're fully nested, both from an accounting perspective, but also from a strategic programmatic perspective. So it's part of a more holistic strategy, and in line with the goals and strategy of the jurisdiction and the stakeholders, and rapidly scaling supply through these larger scale programs over time. So this is a vision that we're urging companies to lean into and support. Next slide. And finally, this is actually a summary of a more detailed table in the document that tries to provide guidance understanding that country circumstances are critical, and how quickly these jurisdictional programs can scale will vary a lot by the country circumstances, the institutions, the governance, and in many cases, there's a need for companies to be working alongside public donors, philanthropic donors, others, to support these developments. But it's important to think about sort of three general cases. The first row is where jurisdictional programs are already moving and likely to be issuing credits in the relatively near term, where it's more sort of a medium-term scenario, and where not for the foreseeable future, given governance and other barriers. There's important things that companies can do in each of these scenarios to be making sure that investments are moving in a more transformational direction. And then we talk about specific due diligence that are required in each case. So we would love to get your guidance both on the overall recommendations, but also more specifically on where the group going forward, any ideas for what would be most helpful to you for the group to lean into. Thanks very much. Next slide. So I think now we're opening it up for discussion.
Great, thanks, Ruben. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, actually, Elizabeth, we're gonna, Salesforce, I think, was gonna jump in and warm us up on the Q&A.
Thank you for reminding me.
Not at all.
I need to cut Jono off. Jono.
Hey, everybody. Huge gratitude to all the presenters here. What an amazing learning. It's been like a master's course in what's happening in just a quick hour. Maybe just a couple very quick reflections. I'd love to get to Q&A and more of a discussion, but on the draft consensus statement, it's just so good to see a lot of the leading NGOs and indigenous groups, starting to speak with one voice at this critical moment where we see a lot of companies who do want to get that quality climate finance deployed. We also heard about the context from all the other initiatives. So really fantastic just to see this work coming together. I thought overall, when you read the draft statement, that it really addressed all the critical issues and was very practically grounded. Different recommendations driving towards jurisdictional, larger scale, engaging government, but also noting that the projects can move faster and that there's a role for both. But clearly setting the bar that we want to see quality credits moving towards that jurisdictional level. I think also fantastic to see recommendation 2 that there's a real recognition that before we go out and fix a problem, we should see if we can stop the problem from occurring in the first place, and the absolute priority that we need to protect forests with climate finance rather than let them get destroyed and then deploy carbon finance to go try and rebuild them. So, again, just really appreciate the thought that's gone into some of these. On the Article 6 too, it was just recommendation 6 on Article 6. Just again, very practical advice for companies and anyone in the space looking towards how they can, sorry, there's a siren going by. How they can deploy their capital and also try to integrate it with these larger systems that are out there. I guess one of the other things that kind of struck me was that this webinar with these kind of recommendations coming out kind of at an interim point really just drives home for me the value proposition of BASX. It's an amazing opportunity to have experts come together, have peers come together, be able to ask questions, be able to get rapid updates, If you do join BASC, if you're already a member, we dig deeper into a lot of these initiatives through our working groups, whether it's the standards and integrity or the tropical forest working groups. So incredibly exciting time seeing all this excitement around quality, and hopefully we're getting towards scale. So why don't I turn it back there, Elizabeth, and see if we've got some questions from the audience or some thoughts from some of our participants.
Great, thank you so much. I just wanted to emphasize a couple of points that Lloyd and Ruben made, and that is really the importance of a jurisdictional approach to aiding in integrity and scaling. And the critical point that while it certainly is important to invest in technological removals to try and bring down the cost and looking towards the future there, especially on the nature-based side with regard to tropical forests, there is nothing more urgent than stopping tropical deforestation. There is no path to a stable climate without doing that. So that absolutely must be prioritized, certainly from our perspective. So I'm being moderator role, but just really wanted to shine a spotlight on those really key points. And then maybe that segues to a really good question we've gotten. Is it correct to interpret the consensus statement as underscoring that a truly additional reduction credit has the same merit for example, offsetting, compensating, neutralizing, counterbalancing, whatever you want to call it, a company's emissions as a truly additional removal credit? Who wants to take that one?
I would certainly agree with that. That yes, reductions are certainly as valid, and actually in most landscapes are actually the highest priority. Lloyd, did you want to add?
Yeah, no, I didn't quite get the question until you started to respond, Ruben, and then I think it came into focus, and yeah, couldn't agree more. One and the same in value, and arguably there's much more co-benefit and other value in the reduction side.
Great, appreciate that clarity. Could you say some more about LEAF and what that is aiming to do, and who's involved, and what's involved with LEAF?
Ruben, that might make sense for you to take first shot at.
I can also pass it maybe to Jono. I don't know if you want to take that.
Oh yeah, of course. We have a coalition
from a coalition perspective. I mean, LEAF is a public-private initiative launched last year. 3 governments and now I think over 20 companies involved to basically mobilize finance commitment for high-quality jurisdictional credits. And there was a call for proposals. More than 20 jurisdictions that were credible. The proposals have passed sort of a screen, or are now interested in moving forward. But maybe Jono, if you wanted to compliment.
I mean, it's Jamie's on here, who's one of the people who really spun it up. So let him speak to a little bit to that. But again, for companies that want to drive towards scale, drive towards integrity, put a forward marker out there that we will be in this game for the long time. We're not just looking for over-the-counter credits. We're looking to put our money where our mouth is. LEAF is an amazing place to be. There's a lot of jurisdictions that have developed very comprehensive initiatives where they can receive financing. It's a fixed rate at $10 a ton right now. So if you want to deploy capital and you want to get high quality credits, LEAF is a great place to be. Jamie, I don't know if you want to say a few more words before we open it up for other questions too, but I know you're here. I see you in the chat space. Okay, he left a note there. He may not be able to come in if he wasn't a panelist. So maybe back to you, Elizabeth.
But LEAF is a pathway for companies that want to access jurisdictional credits to join together to do that. And there's a transaction mechanism under that.
And if I'm not mistaken, there's not a fixed price, but I think a base price of $10 a ton is the kind of starting for negotiations for those. And the volume for those programs will be delivered in the years to come, next 3 to 5 years. However, there are being agreements negotiated in advance of full delivery.
Just one last thing, in case people don't know, that is using the ART-TREE standard, which, you know, when you look at companies who are trying to get audited statements of the carbon credits that they're using for their net zero claims, you know, we see the classic registries that are out there, but now we'll start to see ART-TREEs, I think, come into that sort of accepted high quality standard.
And Emergent is the organization that's sort of serving as the administrator of LEAF and the platform.
There's some important context from Jamie and Max in the chat that I'll shine a light on. From Jamie, that's correct. The initial offer was $10 a ton. We received proposals reflecting massive volumes at that price. So great. And Max pointing out the goal isn't just sending a demand signal, which collectively already passed $1 billion, but actually transact for jurisdictional credits under the ART-TREE standard. So LEAF is one great effort. What else is out there? Where is an appropriate place to access jurisdictional credits market? And will jurisdictional be an attribute of a carbon credit?
Ruben, do you want me to start?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as I know, LEAF is the prevailing existing platform in terms of voluntary market opportunities for jurisdictional credits. There could be more to come. I'm not aware of any coming, but they're getting a great start off of the ground. Will jurisdictional be part of a standard? It's an interesting question. I think it's certainly going to be an attribute of sorts that's considered, because the scale of delivery has a lot of other implications that we kind of implied in our discussion earlier, including perhaps alignment with compliance markets and what comes out of Paris and things like that. So yeah, I think it's going to be a differentiation. Whether it's pulled into an attribute as a standard, that's another question. I will say there are project level standards currently and jurisdictional level standards, which is effectively a separation.
Right. I was going to make that same point and also note that there is as Lloyd showed, a continuum where even for projects, there's, I think, important differentiations in terms of how they are aligning and a pathway to support bigger scale efforts. So that's a critical other element. It's not a completely binary situation, and projects, of course, can be nested within jurisdictional frameworks. But certainly scale, I think we think is really an important attribute of a lot of the quality, although doesn't automatically solve the problems, but has a lot of advantages.
Thanks, that's really helpful. So for companies that are just starting out, trying to figure out how to jump in to this world, it's daunting, it's overwhelming. I have a hard time keeping track of it all. What do you recommend in terms of educating themselves? One thing might be to join BASCs as a member or consider doing that to try and learn from others' experience. But Lloyd, Ruben, maybe any of the others, do you have primers you'd like to point companies to, or if they're ready to jump into the market, areas where they can do so?
Yeah, it strikes me there are a number of useful resources in this space. What's challenging is finding the most useful ones in the pile. Definitely, I hope you'll look at the consensus statement that we talked about, and there's also a number of references in the consensus statement that could be useful. And I think it might make sense to your suggestion, Elizabeth, to see if we can put a couple of maybe favorite resources up on the BASC's website, if that's helpful for people to see. There's lots of things out there, but I wouldn't necessarily pinpoint any immediately, except for WWS visit. No, I'm kidding. Or,
Of course. That's helpful. I think we will try and gather that all together. I know we, and as part of BASC, did create a kind of carbon credits basic guidance. The NGOs that are involved in the initiative really have put together a lot of, I think, key guidance that should really help companies, and we can put that together and share that as broadly as possible.
Elizabeth, I'd make one other more holistic comment, which is that I think it makes sense to come at this, and there are other statements that suggested this direction earlier, but not to come at it just strictly with like a market lens, but with the lens to what are you looking for? What types of activities do you want to support? Talk to people in organizations who are doing work in NBS. And, a lot of these questions that we're getting at are very common sense questions about integrity, about transparency, about delivery. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of understand what might be better versus worse. So take some of that instinct into your deliberations, but then of course it's important to get up on the details of the markets and the standards. Over.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Great point. So how does your effort roll up to VCMI, or how can you, is it going to plug in, or how do you have any idea what the linkage will be there?
I'll take a stab. I think in our view, this is really an important contribution on the supply side integrity piece, and what constitutes a high quality outcome on the ground, and what should companies be supporting on the ground. Then the question becomes, from VCMI, how can companies talk about what they're doing, what's the right sort of claims language, and so on. So I think they're very complementary with VCMI, and then also with the IC-VCM work on integrity. I think many of the issues, we focus on tropical forest because of the importance, and because that's potentially the biggest nature-based solution and source of credits, but also a lot of these issues that we're talking about, could be broadly applied to various kinds of natural climate solutions, as well as other kind of mitigation. So hopefully it can feed in and support that work.
In relation to jurisdictional approaches like LEAF, could you share some thoughts on how a company could approach conducting the due diligence process?
I can say a couple of things on this. First, I think the group that Ruben and I discussed is going to look, I think, at some of these more specific needs or suggestions on due diligence, which will be relevant both at project and jurisdictional level scale. So look for that. It'll probably be 4 months out or something like that. And then of course, due diligence, there's a couple of things to consider, right? One is the standard that a program is operating under. In this case, we're talking about the TREES 2.0 standard, which is a very high bar, a jurisdictional standard. And then is the implementation of the standard on the ground in a particular place. So I think due diligence means definitely getting to know the standard, the reputation of the standard, and then finding some resources, contacts, consultants who have familiarity in the geography and who can bridge the standard to the commitment in the geography. I think it's worth saying that since the tree standard is so high, it's primarily attracting opportunities which are high ambition, fairly rigorous. I don't know if you'd add anything, Ruben.
I'll just add that there, part of the vision of LEAF is to join forces with multiple companies and partners and countries that can help do this together. So it's not, the onus is not all on one single company to be doing this, to have more of a collaboration. And I think that is also the vision of Basques, that by joining together, it's it can facilitate this for companies and also be more have a stronger signal for the countries and actors on the ground.
That's a great point. So the last question is, as further developments push voluntary carbon markets efforts, where do you feel like the nature credits are headed? Biodiversity, water, what's the future here?
What do you think, Ruben? You want to take a shot at it?
Go ahead.
I'll say I'm not an expert and so won't have a lot to say there. I'd say watch the Science-Based Targets Network for all the work they're doing, and on the nature side, I think there are some cautions we should have in mind at the interface of nature metrics and climate metrics. Like absolutely in the work on the ground, we need to be looking for synergy, climate with nature, not at the expense of nature, and nature with climate, not at the expense of climate. But in terms of nature-specific standards or nature claims from climate standards, I think we have to be a little bit careful. But I don't know, Ruben, if you have any thoughts on where that space is going.
I think you summarized it well. Just to emphasize, that there are many things that might also be good for nature that don't necessarily have a strong climate justification, but still might be very good for community benefits, for biodiversity and other benefits.
That is a great point to end on. Thank you all. I'm going to turn it back over to Amir.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you all for coming. We do have a couple of announcements before you get off the call. Blue Carbon Buyers Alliance is an initiative which is incubated within BASC, within the Blue Carbon workstream, and it is there to catalyze the voluntary carbon markets towards blue carbon ecosystem preservation and restoration. BCBA invites you to their farm to table learning sessions. They're set to kick off in February. Blue carbon developers, buyers, and other key stakeholders, they will share case studies as they discuss the state of the market, the challenges, the gaps, and the opportunities for private investments. These learning sessions are open to prospective BCBA members who are interested in learning about voluntary blue carbon market landscape. Just a note, to be part of a BCBA, you have to be a member of BASCs. For more information on BCBA, including the concept note and the overview deck, please visit the BASCs website. And you can also reach out to Whitney Johnston at Salesforce, who is leading this work stream. And how do you get involved in BASCs? You can visit the website. We have a lot of information on our member principles, a membership overview deck, and wealth of foundational resources for companies that are interested in climate solutions. Finally, thank you all. I hope you enjoyed this, and we really hope you join BASCs and are part of future member meetings. Take care.